We've established before that ATP is the energy molecule of the cell. And we'll talk a little bit more about how it's made and how it's the energy molecule of the cell a little bit later on. But first we need to take a look at what this word energy means. The kind of generic definition of energy is just the ability to do work. And work usually means the ability to move something. It's not always movement, but it's the ability to make something happen. And oftentimes we're going to be talking about something moving that requires energy to happen. So let's address why our cells need energy. So why do our cells need this ATP molecule? Well, we've already talked about a couple of reasons why cells need ATP. For example, we talked about active transport in the cell membrane PowerPoint. Remember, active transport is the primary active transport. And our vesicular transport, which includes endocytosis and exocytosis. We also need we also need ATP for things like muscle contractions. And muscle contractions include the muscles involved in breathing, the muscles involved in moving blood around your body. So your cardiac muscle, your heart muscle has to or needs ATP in order to beat to move blood around your body. It also has to do with other skeletal muscles. So moving your body around. Skeletal muscles are also the ones involved in breathing, and et cetera, et cetera. Just any of the movement you do is going to require ATP. We also need ATP for things like nerve impulses, which really rely on these active transport processes here. Now, we could go on and on. There are a lot of reasons why cells need ATP. Oh, one more I want to mention are things like anabolic reactions. So remember, anabolic reactions are ones where we take some like smaller molecules and we bond them together to make bigger molecules. And so, like I said, these are just some of the examples of reasons why cells need energy in the form of this ATP molecule. Now, there are essentially two main types of energy. There's kinetic energy, which is the energy associated with motion. All right, so think about like a ball rolling down a hill has kinetic energy. If you swing your fist to punch somebody, your arm has kinetic energy. A bowling ball rolling down an alley to knock down pins has kinetic energy. All right, so it's just the energy associated with something in motion. Potential energy is also kind of known as stored energy. So this potential energy, we can also kind of call it stored energy, meaning that it's not necessarily performing work at this time, but something could change and make it perform work. So for example, if we look at this example down at the bottom here, we see this person with a ball at the top of the hill. This ball has potential energy, so it's not moving. It doesn't have kinetic energy yet, but if this person lets go or even pushes this ball down the hill, as it starts to roll, it now has kinetic energy. And it's important to note that these two forms of energy can go back and forth. So energy can be converted from potential energy to kinetic energy and from kinetic energy to potential energy. We mentioned how there are basically two main types of energy. So we have kinetic and we have potential energy. Well, there are some subtypes of kinetic energy and some subtypes of potential energy. And the ones that we're going to focus on in this lesson, the subtype of kinetic energy we're going to focus on is something called mechanical energy. Other forms of kinetic energy can include things like light and heat and radiation. Potential energy, we're going to focus on the potential energy stored in chemical bonds. So we're going to refer to chemical energy as the specific type of potential energy that is related to this concept of ATP and making it happen. All right, so mechanical energy definition is very similar to kinetic energy. So it's just the energy involved in that movement of an object. All right, so we can look at kind of two different examples I have here. So we have driving a car and a muscle contraction. And I'll relate these together in a moment here. So chemical energy, remember we said, is a form of potential energy. So it's stored energy. Remember, stored means potential energy. And so chemical bonds actually are able to store energy in them. If you break those bonds, you typically release that energy to be used by something else. If you make bonds, you're actually storing that energy to be used at a later time. So let's go back to our example of driving a car. All right, so when you drive a car, your car in motion has mechanical energy. All right, the car itself has kinetic energy. There has to be mechanical energy to move the wheels to make the car go forward. But that energy has to come from somewhere. And if you've ever run out of gas, you know what happens when you don't have energy going into your engine in your car to make it move. And so for your car, the chemical energy is actually stored in molecules of gasoline. Right? So gasoline is just an organic compound. And it's made up of a whole bunch of carbons bonded together with hydrogens. So gasoline is essentially just a really big hydrocarbon. And each one of these chemical bonds is storing energy in it. So here, stored chemical energy. And so what you do is you take this chemical and you put it in your car, and then your car has different components that are able to break those bonds. And remember, when you break bonds, you release energy. And that released energy gets transferred to the axle and the wheels of the car in order to make it move, which is how you actually move your car and get that kinetic energy. Now, our body does something very similar, but instead of gasoline, because if we drink gasoline, it will kill us, but instead we can eat different kinds of organic compounds, okay? So here I've got the example of sugar, but we can really get the stored energy from lipids, proteins, and other carbohydrates as well. All right, so just the stuff that we eat that gives us energy. Once again, these are just organic compounds, so very similar to gasoline, but different. So don't go drink gasoline. But these are organic compounds, and our cells have specific enzymes that allow us to break down these organic compounds. And as we break down the organic compounds, we're breaking those chemical bonds and releasing that energy. And so in our example here, that released energy gets transferred to our muscle cells, allowing them to contract, which gives us the ability to move our muscles. So we can, flex our biceps, or we can change the shape of our chest cavity so that we can breathe, or our heart can contract in order to move blood around our body. As mentioned previously, ATP is the energy molecule of the cell. So you can think of ATP and energy as being essentially the same thing. And ATP stands for adenosine triphosphate. So that's where the letters ATP comes from. And ATP is a molecule that is able to store energy in its chemical bonds. And remember that these chemical bonds are potential energy. So if we look at our ATP molecule down here in this picture, so this is our ATP molecule. We can also kind of draw it, I kind of draw it like this just to make it a little easier for me to visualize what this looks like. So I just have my adenosine as the A, and then I've got my 3 phosphate groups kind of bonded from that adenosine. All right, so essentially the adenosine and ribose, this part makes the adenosine part. And then tri means 3. So 3 phosphates. We can see there's phosphate number 1, phosphate number 2, and phosphate number 3. Now, all of these bonds have chemical energy stored in them, but the bond between the second and third phosphates is an especially high energy bond. All right, so it's this bond that really stores a lot of energy. And so this bond is going to be made and broken as we basically make ATP and then use ATP. So ATP can actually be made from a molecule called ADP. Which stands for adenosine diphosphate. Where di means 2, and you'll notice that there's 2 phosphates, plus a phosphate just kind of hanging out on its own. And when the bond is formed between the second and third phosphates, we can form our ATP, which remember is our adenosine triphosphate. Where tri means 3, and we've got 1, 2, 3 phosphates. Now, this reaction is reversible, so we can also draw a backward arrow, because remember, we can essentially make and break that, that bond between the second and third phosphates in order to either store energy or release energy. So in order to make that bond, there has to be an input of energy because you have to store that energy. Okay, so we can think about energy. In this case, it's going to be energy from the organic compounds that you eat. So remember, this is things like lipids, which are the fats, proteins, and carbohydrates. And so what cells do is they break the bonds between the atoms in these molecules, and they release that energy. And what happens is that energy goes into this reaction, and then that energy gets stored in this bond between the second and third phosphates. Now, in the opposite reaction, where ATP gets broken down into ADP and an extra phosphate, that energy can then be released. And that released energy can go to something like a pump. So for primary active transport, we have this transport protein called a pump that moves things like ions across the cell membrane. Or maybe it goes to a muscle cell in order to make it contract. Or maybe it goes into an anabolic reaction in order to form a bond between 2 other molecules that are getting, put together to make a bigger molecule. So in essence, we can kind of think of ATP as like a rechargeable battery. ATP itself is like a charged battery. All right, so this is a battery that is ready to go. You can put it into something and make something happen, whereas ADP and phosphate would be like a dead battery. where you've used up all the charge in the battery, but it could be recharged and used again as long as you get an input of energy. You can think about this with something like your cell phone, for example. Your cell phone, you can't just plug it into a wall and use it. There's actually a battery that's an intermediate between the electricity and the wall socket and the actual applications on your phone. So in order to charge your phone, you have to have an input from the electricity from the outlet. That outlet goes in and it charges the battery, and then you can use the battery to play Candy Crush or make a phone call or surf the internet or something like that. But once again, you've got this battery as the intermediate, and that's exactly what happens in our cells, where ATP is kind of this intermediate between these organic compounds and the cells themselves. Because we can't just take sugar and rub it on a cell and make the cell have energy and do something. It has to be first converted to ATP to then be used by the cell in order to fulfill a function.